Okay, so we've talked about utilitarianism's general framework for punishment, right? Why do we punish criminals? How in the world does that end up creating more happiness, given the big costs in punishing criminals? Well, deterrence, right? Crimes cause a lot of unhappiness, worse crimes cause more. Even though punishment causes unhappiness in and of itself, if we can deter some crime, it will be worth it. Well, how do we set punishments? Well, more punishment equals more deterrence, but we really quickly run into a point where more punishment gets you less deterrence. And after a certain point, it stops being worth it, right? Where that point is will depend on the crime. You know, and to answer that exactly, we would need to be criminologists. We would need to figure out, how much deterrence do you get? How much does this cost? But I am not a criminologist. I'm not a psychologist. I can't tell you exactly, but that's the basic framework. One thing I can suggest, and I think is true, is that we have probably exceeded that point for a lot of punishments in the US. I don't know enough about these things to tell you exactly where the point would be. This would be a great subject for a really clever economist or criminologist or some kind of like group work for them. And maybe that works out there. I don't know of it. But I am pretty confident that for some punishments, probably for a lot of punishments, we pay too much. We punish too harshly. We do not end up hitting that sweet spot where the deterrence we get is worth what we pay for it. So, what would a utilitarian say about criminal punishments in the US? I'm not sure exactly, but my short answer is I'm pretty certain he would say or she would say some are way too harsh. And just to make this manageable, let's focus on drug laws as a case study. There's been some change here, but drug laws are notoriously harsh. Let me give you guys some examples. Possession of a Schedule 1 or 2 drug. I looked this up, came across a lot of like lawyers' websites. But as far as I could tell, possession of a Schedule 1 or 2 drug in Virginia can get you up to 10 years in prison. Now my Google results are going to be fun with what they recommend me. I'm sure Google now thinks that I've been caught with a lot of drugs, right? You know, Schedule 1 drugs are things like LSD, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine. The government has its own technical definition of these things, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, blah, blah, blah. Suffice it to say, these are what most of us would count as quote unquote hard drugs by any definition of the term. The government still puts marijuana in Schedule 1, I think, although there's been some efforts to move it. Virginia, honestly, I think we've mostly legalized it. The laws on marijuana are just a mess, right? So I'm not going to talk much about it. Suffice it to say, it's always been really weird to group marijuana in with stuff like heroin or cocaine. But anyway, these drugs in Virginia will get you a long sentence, especially if you have a lot of them. Schedule 3 drugs will get you up to a year in prison in this state. And this is stuff like ketamine, steroids, Tylenol with codeine. Well, do these make sense from a utilitarian perspective? I think for a utilitarian, these are almost certainly too severe, too heavy. Look, I'm not an expert on this. If you guys have read more on this or you know someone who has, I will take correction on this because I am not an expert. But, as research for these classes, I've read a couple books. The best one of the lot was this one, Drugs and Drug Policy, What Everyone Should Know. Not a super creative title, but, very good book by these guys, Kleiman and Calkins. And they talk a lot about how it is that making drugs illegal deters use. And the main way it does that is A, it puts a social stigma on drugs. A lot of people who might otherwise think about doing drugs just won't do it because it's illegal. There are a lot of people like that. And it also makes drugs a lot more expensive. You drive the costs of drugs up a lot just by making them illegal and just by attaching any kind of punishment for selling them. But they point out that the point of diminishing returns, for drug penalties at least, is very, very soon. More punishment does very little to drive the price of drugs up more. They talk about, in the 80s, we came down incredibly hard on cocaine, especially crack cocaine. Just really harsh sentences, a lot of enforcement. And they say, well, maybe, as far as we can tell, it drove the price of cocaine up 5%, maybe 10% tops, right? Think about this, right? If you, I mean, I like fancy beer, right? I will sometimes go get a 6-pack of really nice beer. I really like coffee too. You know, if the price of my favorite beer or coffee went up 5%, I don't even know that I would notice, right? If it went up 10, I might notice. I probably wouldn't do less of it, right? Well, same goes for drugs. 10% is not going to get you much deterrence. Now, these guys are very clear. They think drugs should be legal, right? If you look at what's happened with the opioid crisis, they approach this very much as utilitarians. If we make other drugs fully legal, the opioid crisis, it's not like they're legal, but doctors have overprescribed. If we made stuff like this fully legal, you would have huge problems. Use would skyrocket, addiction would skyrocket, it would be bad. But the authors think, well, keep drugs illegal, but just have very, very light punishments for it. That'll do as much to drive the price up as anything, right? And I think they're probably right? We could really, really, really drop the punishments for drug laws, not get rid of them entirely, but mostly, even for people who deal drugs, get this down to a very small amount and probably get about as much deterrence as we have now. With drugs, I think every indication is that we are overpaying. They also say we should do more targeted enforcement. Honestly, if they're not violent and they're not selling open air, they think we should just leave drug dealers alone. All right. Now, that's just me talking about drugs. That's just one case. But I think a lot of this holds for a lot of other criminal punishments, right? Go down the list and ask yourself, is this punishment worth what we're paying for it? I think in a lot of cases with a lot of punishments we have in America, the answer is going to be no. I'll wrap up, utilitarian thoughts about punishment in the next lecture, but, that's just the general framework, and we can think of drugs as a sort of test case.